Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode number 100 considers the topic of exploring a landscape in archaeology. In my work, I enjoy exploring places and learning about the natural and cultural histories of landscapes. As an archaeologist, I look for certain clues about how a place has changed through time and how people could have lived with these changing conditions through time. In this video, I will share some of my observations and thought process when I investigated at Ritidian or Litekyan in Guam, where I recovered the evidence of the long-term landscape chronology ever since people first lived here around 1500 BC. The landscape explorations allowed me to see through the layers of time and to understand where to look for the ancient archaeological site layers. The most ancient site layers now have become buried and hidden deep beneath the ground. When I started to explore this landscape, I had not yet seen those ancient layers. Instead, on the modern surface, I could see the beaches and coastline, the dense forest, and the limestone on the ground surface today. In many places, I noticed stonework ruins and artifacts on the surface, dating from the last time when people actively lived here during the AD 1600s. Additionally, I observed rock art in some of the caves, dating from variable time periods and with unclear associations at first glance. Many other people already had made these same initial observations previously. In my work, though, I wanted to look deeper and to understand how this landscape had changed through time. I started with learning about the geological formations. Superficially, the extensive limestone plateau of northern Guam may not seem like the most attractive place for ancient habitation sites. Most notably, the limestone plateau contains no rivers or streams that could otherwise act as reliable water supplies. Nonetheless, the limestone plateau internally contains an impressively large freshwater aquifer. If people during ancient times could access this aquifer, then certainly they could sustain large communities and villages in this area. In this case, I looked for places where people could access this vital resource without the use of metal mining tools or modern drilling techniques. I found numerous spots where this access was possible, in caves that reached into the water source, and in coastal seepage flows that discharged just above sea level. The limestone terrain here happens to include numerous caves and cavities. Some of those caves extend partially into the natural aquifer. Additionally, I knew that the sea level had changed through time, and accordingly the position of the overlying freshwater lands had changed. Based on my knowledge of the sea level history, I could measure the positions of where the ancient freshwater lands could have been accessible during different time periods. The freshwater lens naturally flows out toward sea level, and therefore certain areas along the seashore can reveal the freshwater seepage flows. Especially during low tide events, these coastal seepage flows are easy to identify. The exact positions of the water access have changed through time, due to the fluctuations in sea level and related transformations of the coastal landforms. Nonetheless, the geological and hydrological principles, of course, have been constant through time, and people during any time period could have found these kinds of freshwater sources. The precise spots of freshwater access today could be applied back in time through the last few centuries, such as in connection with the traditional village sites of the AD 1600s. This potential alone greatly enhances the ability to understand the landscape setting of the site ruins on the ground surface today. Regarding older time periods, only the approximate positions of water access can be ascertained. Overall, though, the amount of water supply always existed to sustain traditional communities and villages during any time period when people lived here. After I learned about the water and hydrology issues, I considered that people probably always could have lived in the coastal areas near sea level, where they could find the most opportunities of freshwater access during any time period. In this case, the sea level history became even more important for me to understand and to coordinate with my explorations of the landscape. I will not repeat all of the details in this video, but I can clarify how I looked for certain clues in the landscape about the ancient sea level. Other researchers in geology already had documented the relics of tidal notches, the remnants of ancient coral reefs, and other indications of a higher sea level prior to about 1100 BC. I refined this information through my own observations, measurements, and radiocarbon dating. When people first lived here around 1500 BC, the sea level was about 1.8 meters higher than today. In this ancient landscape, the seashore was positioned farther inland than where it can be seen today. At that time, the modern-day sandy beaches and coral reefs did not yet exist. Instead, the most ancient sandy beaches were small fringes around the outward bottom edges of the limestone formations of the island. Through the time span when people had lived in this place, the limestone terrain has been more or less stable and consistent. In other words, people always could have used the limestone terrain for various purposes. In this situation, the limestone landforms potentially could be places of ancient sites from any time period. The limestone areas showed very little or no sedimentary buildup or soil development, and therefore, potentially, I could search for ancient archaeological evidence on or near the surface. The vegetation growth created the major obstacle in my observations. As long as I could invest the time to explore through the thick vegetation, then I could be confident about my visual inspection of the terrain on the surface, with limited amounts of excavation to augment and refine my observations. In many places where trees had fallen down, I could check for possible broken pottery or other materials from the past. In the limestone terrain at Ritidian, I found extremely sparse traces of broken pottery that dated to the first few centuries AD in just a few isolated spots. Otherwise, people did not create formal habitation sites in the limestone terrain until after approximately AD 1000, when people made numerous traditional houses known as Lati of Guam and the Mariana Islands. The house ruins and artifacts are abundant on the surface today, and they dated to the last time when people lived in these villages during the late AD 1600s. In terms of finding these sites and interpreting how many people lived in these places, I could observe the modern-day limestone terrain, water access, and other parts of the environment as reasonable reflections of those past contexts. I wanted to explore the possibility of finding evidence from older time periods, and therefore I needed to look for geological formations and sedimentary units other than the central mass of the limestone terrain that so far had shown only later periods of past cultural use. Toward this goal, my study of the sea level history proved to be the most useful in terms of knowing where to look for the ancient sandy beaches. Today, these spots of ancient beaches are found more than 100 meters inland and more than 1 meter deep. Additionally, I conducted extensive test pit excavations as a way to confirm that my observations were indeed accurate about the ancient sea level and the shape of the ancient shoreline. This research allowed me to portray how the coastal landscape changed through time and how people adjusted with this landscape since about 1500 BC. Now, when I walk through the modern coastal plain landform, I know the spots where the ancient shoreline had been situated. Those ancient beach surfaces now have been buried beneath the ground, but I can detect faint traces of their positions in some places. Just like in the modern beach today, the ancient beach surface included a sloped edge or an incipient ridge around the high tide mark. Through time, more recent sedimentary units accumulated over these spots, but traces of the original shape still can be discerned in some cases. After I learned about the chronology of the landscape and the sequence of archaeological layers, then I began to concentrate more on the cave areas. Numerous caves contribute to the unique character of the limestone terrain and the landscape at Ritidian. Some of the caves contained rock art of various forms, colors, styles, and time periods. The nearby archaeological deposits consistently pointed to ritual or ceremonial contexts at these caves. Most of the cave evidence related to the later time periods after about AD 1000. The oldest evidence, though, extended back to 1500 BC at 2 of the caves, proving that the special contexts of these caves were important for people ever since they first lived here. This approach of exploring a landscape was helpful for me at Ritidian or Litekyan in Guam, and it has been productive for me in many other studies. Plenty of my colleagues have used a similar research approach, although the specific details can be different. When I explore a landscape as an archaeologist, then I make observations with two major questions in mind. First, how did the shape of the environment influence where people could live and what people could do in the landscape? Second, how did people live with the changing conditions of their landscape through time? In concluding this episode, I hope that I have shared some of my approach and thought process about exploring a landscape as an archaeologist. What are some of your thoughts and observations when you encounter a landscape? How would you apply some of this knowledge? If you have not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, then please consider to do so, share with your friends, and explore more online videos with the Archaeology Studio.